The helicopter insertion at 0200 hours went exactly according to plan, which immediately made Sarah nervous. In her experience analyzing military operations, when everything went perfectly at the beginning of a mission, it usually meant that all the problems were waiting later. The team landed 2 kilometers from the target compound in a dry riverbed that provided natural concealment from observation. The night was clear, with minimal cloud cover and good visibility under a quarter moon. Temperature was holding steady at 68 degrees, with light winds from the southeast. Perfect conditions for a tactical operation. Major Thompson took point as the team moved toward their first checkpoint, with Captain Martinez managing security intervals and Sarah positioned in the center of the formation where she could monitor communications and provide real-time cultural intelligence updates. The terrain between the landing zone and the compound was exactly what the satellite imagery had indicated: rocky, sparse vegetation, with natural concealment routes that allowed them to approach without exposing themselves to observation from the compound or surrounding areas. 20 minutes into the approach, Sarah received the first communication from her tribal contacts. "Raven Base, this is Phoenix 1, she whispered into her headset microphone. "I'm receiving confirmation signal from local contacts. Tribal security has been withdrawn from the eastern approach route, as discussed." "Copy, Phoenix 1, Thompson responded. Proceeding to Checkpoint 2. Sarah had spent months developing the communication protocols that allowed her to coordinate with tribal contacts while maintaining operational security. The signals were simple but effective. Light patterns that indicated all clear, modified traditional calls that conveyed specific information about compound security, and subtle changes in normal activity patterns that could warn of complications. As they approached Checkpoint 2, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. "Raven Base, Phoenix 1. I'm observing livestock movement patterns that don't match normal nighttime behavior." "Explain." Thompson's voice came back immediately. Sarah studied the area through her night vision equipment. "There are goats moving in the area between Checkpoint 2 and the compound. They should be secured for the night, but they're actively grazing. That could indicate recent human activity." Captain Martinez's voice joined the communication. "Could be normal activity, or could be security patrols using livestock movement as cover." Sarah considered this possibility. In her cultural analysis of the region, she had identified Sarah spent the night before the mission doing what she did best, preparing for every possible scenario she could imagine, and several she hoped would never happen. Her quarters at FOB Vanguard were spartanly furnished, but efficiently organized. 3 laptops sat open on her desk, each displaying different intelligence feeds. Satellite imagery covered one screen, showing real-time updates of the target compound and surrounding area. The second screen displayed cultural database information about the local tribal leadership, including family relationships, historical conflicts, and economic dependencies that could impact their reaction to American military presence. The third laptop contained her personal analysis files, built up over months of studying this specific region. At 0200 hours, Sarah was still working, cross-referencing weather reports with cultural calendar events to identify factors that might influence civilian movement patterns around the compound. She had learned early in her intelligence career that successful operations depended as much on what you anticipated as what you planned for. A soft knock at her door interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called, expecting to see one of the night shift communications officers with updated intelligence reports. Instead, Major Thompson entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept either. "Figured you might be awake," he said, offering her one of the cups. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. It was strong enough to wake the dead, which was exactly what she needed. "Thank you, Major. Is there something I can help you with?" Thompson settled into the chair across from her desk, his large frame making the furniture look almost comically small. "Actually, I was hoping I could help you." Sarah studied his face, trying to read his expression. In the briefing room earlier, Thompson had been clearly skeptical of her assignment. Now he seemed almost supportive. "I'm listening," she said carefully. "I've been thinking about tomorrow's mission," Thompson began. "About the tactical coordination between cultural intelligence and field operations. And I realized that if this mission fails, it won't be because our tactical planning was insufficient. It'll be because we couldn't adapt to circumstances that our standard training didn't prepare us for. Sarah nodded slowly. Cultural factors are usually treated as background information, not operational variables. Exactly. Which is why I wanted to understand your approach better. Thompson leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from casual to intensely professional. Walk me through how you analyze a situation like tomorrow's mission. Sarah turned to her laptops and began pulling up files. Okay, let's start with the basic scenario. We need to extract Dr. Hassan from a compound in territory controlled by the Bani Rashid tribe. Standard tactical assessment says we insert at 0200, neutralize perimeter security, locate the target, and extract within 30 minutes, Thompson said. Right. But that assumes the compound is just a building with security guards. Sarah opened a detailed demographic analysis. The reality is more complicated. The Bani Rashid have been in conflict with two neighboring tribes for the past 8 months over water rights. Dr. Hassan isn't just hiding in their territory. He's been providing technical expertise for a well-digging project that could resolve the dispute. Thompson frowned. How does that affect our extraction approach? If we appear to be taking Hassan by force, the Bani Rashid won't see it as an arrest. They'll see it as outsiders destroying their chance at ending a conflict that's already cost them livestock and trade relationships. Sarah pulled up another screen showing tribal leadership structures. Hassan isn't just a target hiding in their territory. As far as they're concerned, he's a valuable ally who's solving a critical problem. So a standard tactical approach could turn the entire tribe against us. Worse than that, if we're seen as the reason their water conflict continues, the Bani Rashid could retaliate against American interests throughout the region. We could be creating a long-term security threat that's far worse than the immediate problem Hassan represents. Thompson was quiet for a moment, processing this information. What's your alternative approach? Sarah opened a detailed cultural protocol document she had been working on for the past 3 hours. We framed the extraction as helping the Bani Rashid solve their water problem permanently. How do we do that? Hassan's technical expertise is valuable, but it's not irreplaceable. Before we extract him, we provide the tribal leadership with alternative technical resources that can complete the well project. We position his departure not as a loss, but as a transition to a more sustainable solution. Thompson stared at the screen as Sarah showed him the technical specifications for well drilling equipment that could be provided through military aid channels. You're talking about actually solving their water conflict as part of the extraction mission. I'm talking about making Hassan's departure beneficial to the tribe instead of harmful. If we can accomplish that, they might actually help us extract him instead of trying to protect him. Thompson paused, clearly struggling with the concept. That's not how military operations typically work. No, it's not. Standard military operations assume that achieving our objective and helping local populations are separate goals. Sometimes they're even conflicting goals. Sarah pulled up a map showing regional water sources and tribal territories. But, in this case, those goals can be aligned. We get Hassan, the Bani Rashid get a permanent solution to their water problem, and the regional stability improves instead of deteriorating. Thompson studied the map carefully. This would require advanced coordination with tribal leaders. I've already established contact through intermediaries. The initial discussions have been positive. When did you set up these contacts? 3 months ago, when I first started analyzing Hassan's location. I've been building relationships with local sources since then. Thompson looked at her with something approaching amazement. You've been planning this mission for 3 months? I've been preparing for this type of mission for 3 months. I didn't know it would specifically involve Hassan until yesterday, but I've been studying the regional dynamics and building intelligence networks because I knew eventually we'd need them. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and reviewing the information on Sarah's screens. Lieutenant, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Why didn't you mention any of this in the briefing yesterday? Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. Because Colonel Harrison was already having to defend my assignment to the team. If I had started talking about alternative mission approaches that depend on cultural coordination, it would have sounded like I was trying to completely redesign a mission I wasn't qualified to lead. But you are qualified to lead it. I'm qualified to handle the cultural intelligence aspects. Whether that makes me qualified to lead the mission is something we'll find out tomorrow. Thompson stood up and moved to the window. Outside, the base was quiet except for the routine movements of night security patrols. Lieutenant, I need to tell you something. Okay. After the briefing yesterday, Captain Martinez and I discussed requesting that Colonel Harrison reconsider your role in this mission. Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she kept her expression neutral. I see. We were wrong, Thompson continued. Not about questioning assignments we didn't understand, but about assuming that cultural intelligence was somehow less important than tactical expertise. He turned back to face her. What you just showed me isn't support information for a tactical operation. It's a completely different approach to achieving the same objective, and it's probably a better approach. I appreciate that, Major. But, no, let me finish. Thompson moved back to the chair, but remained standing. I've been leading military operations for 12 years. I'm good at tactical planning, team coordination, and adapting to combat situations. But what you just described would never have occurred to me, not even as an alternative approach. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to this admission. Tomorrow, when we're in the field, I want you to make cultural intelligence decisions without checking with me first. If you think the tactical approach needs to change based on cultural factors, just change it. Major, that's not how command structure works. It's how this mission is going to work, Thompson said firmly. Because I'd rather have a successful mission with an unconventional command structure than a failed mission with perfect tactical coordination. After Thompson left, Sarah returned to her preparation work, but the conversation had changed her perspective on the upcoming mission. For the first time since Colonel Harrison had assigned her to lead the cultural aspects, she began to believe that the team might actually trust her judgment. At 0400 hours, she received a secure communication from her tribal contacts confirming that the Bani Rashid leadership was willing to meet with American representatives about the water project technical assistance. The meeting was scheduled for 1800 hours, 6 hours before the planned extraction. This was the kind of development that could either make the mission significantly easier or create complications that no tactical plan could address. Sarah began updating her mission protocols to account for this new variable. At 0530, she finally closed her laptops and tried to get 30 minutes of sleep before the final mission briefing. At 0600 hours sharp, Sarah entered the briefing room to find the entire team already assembled. Major Thompson gave her a nod that seemed almost encouraging. Captain Martinez looked alert, but nervous. Staff Sergeant Morrison was, as usual, doing something with a knife. Lieutenant Stevens was stretching in the corner. Colonel Harrison entered promptly at 0605. Good morning. Final mission briefing for Operation Desert Shield. He moved immediately to the detailed compound maps. Intelligence updates since yesterday indicate that Dr. Hassan's security detail has been reduced from 8 to 6 personnel. This could suggest either reduced threat assessment or resource limitations. Sarah raised her hand. Sir, I have additional cultural intelligence that affects the mission approach. Go ahead, Lieutenant. Sarah moved to the map and pointed to the compound location. My tribal contacts have confirmed that Hassan is providing technical assistance for a water project that's critical to resolving a regional conflict. This changes the dynamic of his presence in the compound from protected guest to valuable ally. Captain Martinez leaned forward. How does that affect extraction difficulty? It means that a standard tactical extraction will be seen as an attack on tribal interests rather than an arrest operation. However, we have an opportunity to frame the extraction differently. Sarah outlined her alternative approach, explaining the advanced coordination with tribal leadership and the provision of alternative technical resources for their water project. As she talked, she watched the team's reactions carefully. Major Thompson was nodding approvingly. Captain Martinez looked intrigued but concerned about operational complexity. Staff Sergeant Morrison had stopped playing with his knife and was paying careful attention. Lieutenant Stevens had stopped stretching and was taking notes. Colonel Harrison listened without interruption until Sarah finished her presentation. Lieutenant, this approach requires significant coordination outside standard operational parameters. Yes, sir. But it also eliminates most of the potential for civilian casualties and long-term regional destabilization. What's the timeline for implementing this approach? Tribal meeting at 1800 hours today to finalize technical assistance arrangements. Extraction proceeds as scheduled at 0200 hours tomorrow, but with tribal cooperation rather than resistance. Colonel Harrison studied the map carefully. Major Thompson, what's your assessment of this approach from a tactical perspective? Thompson straightened in his chair. Sir, it's unconventional, but it addresses several tactical concerns I had about the standard extraction approach. If we can eliminate local resistance, the mission becomes significantly safer for our team and more likely to succeed. Captain Martinez? The coordination requirements are complex, sir, but Lieutenant Chun appears to have already established the necessary contacts and protocols. From a risk management perspective, this approach is superior. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. Lieutenant Chun, you have authorization to proceed with tribal coordination. Major Thompson, prepare tactical alternatives that support both standard extraction and cooperative extraction scenarios. Yes, sir. Both officers responded simultaneously. The briefing continued with detailed review of equipment, communication protocols, and contingency plans. Sarah found herself actively participating in tactical discussions for the first time in her career, contributing insights about how cultural factors might affect each aspect of the mission. At 0800 hours, Colonel Harrison dismissed the team with final instructions to report for equipment check at 1200 hours. As the team filed out, Sarah realized that the dynamic had shifted significantly since the previous day's briefing. The skepticism was still there, but it was now balanced by professional respect and operational confidence. At 1200 hours, Sarah stood in the equipment bay wearing full tactical gear for the first time in her military career. The body armor felt heavier than she had expected, the helmet changed her field of vision, and the communications equipment required constant adjustment. Staff Sergeant Morrison approached her with a tactical vest that had been modified with additional equipment pockets. Lieutenant, figured you might need extra space for your cultural intelligence materials. Thank you, Sergeant. That's very thoughtful. Also, Colonel Harrison requested that you carry this. Morrison handed her a sidearm in a tactical holster. Sarah looked at the weapon uncertainly. Sergeant, I'm qualified with standard-issue firearms, but I'm not a combat specialist. Nobody expects you to be, ma'am. But if things go wrong tomorrow night, everyone on the team needs to be able to protect themselves and each other. Sarah attached the holster to her vest, hoping desperately that she would never need to use it. At 1400 hours, the team conducted final equipment checks and communications tests. Sarah's tactical gear functioned properly, but she felt awkward and conspicuous wearing it. At 1600 hours, Sarah reviewed final intelligence updates and confirmed that her tribal contacts were prepared for the 1800 meeting. At 1730 hours, she joined Major Thompson for the final tactical briefing. Lieutenant, Thompson said as they reviewed insertion routes, I want you to know that regardless of what happens tomorrow night, you've already changed how I think about military operations. How so? You've shown me that tactical success and cultural understanding don't have to be separate objectives, that accomplishing the mission and helping local populations can be the same goal. Sarah felt a mix of pride and pressure. Thank you, Major. I hope tomorrow proves that approach works in practice, not just in theory. At 1800 hours exactly, Sarah met with representatives of the Bani Rashid tribal leadership in a secure location outside the main compound. The meeting was conducted in Arabic, with Sarah serving as both negotiator and cultural interpreter. The tribal representatives were initially suspicious, but became increasingly cooperative as Sarah outlined the technical assistance that would be provided for their water project. By 1900 hours, they had reached an agreement that would frame Dr. Hassan's departure as part of a transition to more sustainable technical support. At 1930 hours, Sarah returned to FOB Vanguard with confirmation that the tribal leadership would cooperate with the extraction operation. At 2000 hours, she briefed the team on the results of the tribal meeting and the final operational approach. At 2100 hours, the team conducted final equipment checks and mission preparation. At 2200 hours, Sarah tried unsuccessfully to get some sleep before the mission. At 2300 hours, she gave up on sleep and spent the final 3 hours before insertion reviewing every detail of the cultural protocols and contingency plans. At 0200 hours on the second day, Operation Desert Shield began. The morning Sarah Chun walked into Forward Operating Base Vanguard. Three things happened simultaneously. The temperature felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and someone in the back of the room actually snorted with laughter. She had expected this reaction. After 8 years in military intelligence, 5 deployments, and a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies from Georgetown, Sarah knew exactly what people saw when they looked at her. At 5 feet 4 inches, with a slight build and wire-rimmed glasses that she constantly adjusted when thinking, she looked more like a graduate student than a battle-tested officer. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, her black hair pulled back in regulation style, and her expression carried the kind of quiet intensity that people either respected immediately or completely missed. Unfortunately, most people missed it. The briefing room at FOB Vanguard was filled with exactly the type of soldiers Sarah had spent her career working alongside, but never quite fitting in with. There was Major Bradley Thompson, a bull of a man whose biceps strained against his uniform sleeves, and whose voice could probably be heard 3 buildings away. Captain Rick Martinez sat beside him, lean and scarred, with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that came from too many night raids and close calls. Staff Sergeant Danny Morrison was cleaning his fingernails with a knife that looked like it had seen serious action, while Lieutenant Jake Stevens was doing push-ups in the corner because, apparently, sitting still was not an option for him. These were the men who had volunteered for Operation Desert Shield, a mission so classified that even Sarah only knew pieces of it. What she did know was that it involved extracting a high-value target from a compound deep in hostile territory, and that intelligence suggested the target had information that could prevent a major terrorist attack on American soil. What she didn't know was why she had been called to this briefing. Colonel James Harrison entered the room like a force of nature. At 52, he was the kind of career military officer who had earned respect through decades of successful operations and hard decisions. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the casual atmosphere in the room shifted to professional focus. "Gentlemen," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "And lady," he added, with a glance toward Sarah that seemed almost apologetic. The slight pause that followed that addition told Sarah everything she needed to know about how this briefing was going to go. "Operation Desert Shield is a go for tomorrow night," the colonel continued, moving to a large map mounted on the wall. "Our target is Dr. Ahmad Hassan, a former chemical engineer who's been feeding intelligence to terrorist networks for the past 18 months. 3 days ago, our sources confirmed he's planning to meet with buyers for a chemical weapon formula that could kill thousands of civilians." The room grew tenser as the colonel outlined the mission parameters. The compound where Dr. Hassan was hiding was located in a region known for its complex tribal politics, shifting alliances, and terrain that had swallowed up military units before. Worse, recent intelligence suggested that Hassan had hired local mercenaries for protection, turning what should have been a simple extraction into a potential combat situation. "The mission requires someone who understands the cultural dynamics of the region," Colonel Harrison continued. "Someone who can navigate the political sensitivities, communicate with local contacts, and adapt the plan if things go sideways." Major Thompson straightened in his chair. "Sir, I've run operations in that region before. I can handle the political aspects." Colonel Harrison shook his head. "Major, your expertise is valuable, but this mission requires someone with deeper cultural knowledge and language skills." Captain Martinez leaned forward. "Colonel, I speak Arabic and Farsi. I've worked with local interpreters extensively. Conversational level won't be enough for this operation, Captain." Sarah watched this exchange with growing confusion. If they needed cultural expertise and advanced language skills, why was she the only intelligence officer in the room? Usually, mission briefings included the entire operational team. The fact that she was here alone suggested either a mistake in scheduling or something else entirely. "Sir," Lieutenant Stevens interrupted, "who exactly will be handling the cultural intelligence aspects of this mission?" Colonel Harrison turned to look directly at Sarah. "Lieutenant Chun will be leading the cultural and intelligence components of this operation." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. Major Thompson was the first to speak. Sir, with all due respect, Lieutenant Chun is an intelligence analyst. She's never run field operations. That's correct, Major. However, she's the only officer on this base who speaks fluent Arabic, Farsi, and 3 regional dialects. She's also the only one who spent the last 2 years studying the specific tribal dynamics in Hassan's region. Captain Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Colonel, intelligence analysis and field leadership are very different skill sets. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't the first time her qualifications had been questioned, and it probably wouldn't be the last. What surprised her was that Colonel Harrison seemed to be defending her assignment. Gentlemen, the colonel said, his tone carrying a warning edge, I didn't call this briefing to debate personnel assignments. Lieutenant Chin's role in this mission is non-negotiable. Staff Sergeant Morrison looked up from his knife. What exactly will Lieutenant Chin's role be, sir? Colonel Harrison moved to a detailed map of the target compound. She'll be coordinating with our local contacts, managing real-time intelligence updates, and adapting tactical approaches based on cultural factors that could impact mission success. From the command post? Major Thompson asked hopefully. Negative. Lieutenant Chun will be accompanying the extraction team into the field. This time, the silence was broken by what could only be described as nervous laughter from several team members. Sarah finally spoke. Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but I think there might be some confusion about my qualifications for field operations. Colonel Harrison studied her for a moment. Lieutenant, are you familiar with the Hassan extraction analysis you submitted last month? Yes, sir. In that analysis, you identified 17 different scenarios that could complicate a standard extraction approach. You provided tactical alternatives for each scenario, including specific cultural protocols that could prevent the mission from turning into a diplomatic disaster. Sarah nodded slowly. She remembered the report. It had taken her 3 weeks to complete, cross-referencing tribal leadership structures, historical conflicts, and economic relationships that could all impact how local populations might react to American military presence. What you may not know, the colonel continued, is that your analysis prevented a catastrophic failure in Operation Mountain Eagle 3 weeks ago. The team leader read your cultural briefings, recognized one of the scenarios you had outlined, and adapted the mission approach accordingly. Instead of a firefight that could have killed civilians and created an international incident, they completed a clean extraction with 0 casualties. The room had grown quiet again, but this time it felt different. Sarah caught Major Thompson looking at her with something that wasn't quite respect yet, but wasn't dismissal either. Colonel Harrison pulled up a chair and sat down, his demeanor shifting from authoritative to almost conversational. Here's what you all need to understand. This isn't a standard extraction mission. Dr. Hassan isn't just hiding. He's been integrated into a community that sees American military presence as a direct threat to their way of life. One wrong move, one cultural misstep, one misunderstood gesture. And this mission doesn't just fail. It turns into the kind of disaster that makes international headlines and gets people killed. He turned back to Sarah. Lieutenant Chun, I'm not asking you to lead this mission because you're the best soldier in this room. I'm asking you to lead it because you're the only person on this base who understands that sometimes winning a battle requires never firing a shot. Sarah felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. She thought about the analysis reports she had written, the cultural briefings she had delivered to rooms full of soldiers who looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. She thought about the transfer request that had been sitting on her desk for the past month, the desk job in Washington that would finally get her out of the field and into a role where her expertise would be valued instead of questioned. Sir, she said quietly, I've never led a team in combat conditions. No, you haven't. But you've spent 8 years preparing for exactly this type of situation. Major Thompson cleared his throat. Colonel, no disrespect intended, but we're talking about inserting someone with no field command experience into a high-risk extraction operation. If things go bad, if we need to adapt tactically under fire, what happens then? Colonel Harrison nodded. That's a fair question, Major. Which is why Lieutenant Chin won't be commanding the tactical aspects of the mission. Major Thompson, you'll retain command of all tactical operations. Captain Martinez will handle team movement and security. Staff Sergeant Morrison will manage equipment and logistics. He stood up and moved to the map again. But when it comes to cultural intelligence, local contacts, and adaptation strategies that could mean the difference between success and disaster, Lieutenant Chun has operational authority. Her decisions in those areas are final. Sarah watched the faces around the room processing this information. She could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. How to work with someone they didn't trust, how to protect a mission they cared about, how to reconcile their experience with a command structure that suddenly didn't make sense to them. Lieutenant Stevens raised his hand. Sir, what happens if Lieutenant Chin's cultural approach conflicts with tactical necessities? Then, you'll figure it out together. Colonel Harrison replied curtly. Because failure isn't an option. The briefing continued for another hour, covering insertion routes, extraction timelines, equipment specifications, and contingency plans. Sarah took detailed notes, asked clarifying questions about tactical procedures she wasn't familiar with, and tried to ignore the undercurrent of skepticism that seemed to follow every comment she made. When the briefing finally ended, Colonel Harrison dismissed the team with orders to report for final preparations at 0600 the next morning. As the other officers filed out, Sarah remained behind, gathering her notes and trying to process what had just happened. Lieutenant Chun, Colonel Harrison called as she reached the door. She turned back. Yes, sir. I know what you're thinking. You're wondering why I'm putting you in a position where you'll be working with people who don't trust your qualifications. Sarah considered lying, but decided honesty might be more valuable. The thought had occurred to me, sir. Colonel Harrison smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him during the entire briefing. 8 years ago, I was a major assigned to a joint task force in Afghanistan. We had a mission that required coordinating with 3 different tribal leaders, each of whom had historical grievances against the others. Our cultural advisor was a young lieutenant who looked like he should have been teaching elementary school instead of briefing combat veterans. He moved to the window and looked out at the base compound. Every single person in that briefing room questioned his assignment. We figured the brass had made a mistake, that someone with more field experience should be handling the cultural aspects. What happened? That young lieutenant's cultural intelligence prevented a 3-way tribal war that could have destabilized the entire region. He saw connections that the rest of us missed, anticipated reactions that our tactical training hadn't prepared us for, and ultimately designed an approach that turned potential enemies into operational allies. Colonel Harrison turned back to her. The mission was a complete success. 0 casualties, objective achieved, and regional stability maintained. That lieutenant went on to become one of the most effective cultural intelligence officers in the military. Sarah felt a mix of hope and pressure settling over her. Sir, what if I'm not as capable as that lieutenant was? Then, people will die, the mission will fail, and Dr. Hassan will sell chemical weapon formulas to terrorists, Colonel Harrison said bluntly. But I don't think that's going to happen. How can you be so certain? Because I've read every analysis you've written for the past 2 years. I've watched you identify patterns that experienced field commanders missed. I've seen you provide solutions to problems that tactical experts couldn't solve. He moved toward the door, then paused. And because I was that young lieutenant in Afghanistan 8 years ago. Sarah stared at him as the implications sank in. You were the cultural advisor? I was. And tomorrow, you're going to prove that cultural intelligence isn't a support function. It's the difference between success and catastrophic failure. After Colonel Harrison left, Sarah sat alone in the briefing room for nearly an hour. She reviewed her notes, studied the mission maps, and tried to prepare herself for the reality that in less than 24 hours, she would be leading her first field operation. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 8 years, she had been asking for opportunities to apply her expertise in operational settings. She had written requests for field assignments, volunteered for missions that utilized cultural intelligence, and repeatedly demonstrated that her analytical skills could have practical battlefield applications. And now, finally, given that opportunity, she was terrified. Outside the briefing room window, she could see Major Thompson and Captain Martinez walking across the compound, their heads close together in intense conversation. She wondered what they were discussing, whether they were developing contingency plans that didn't include her, whether they were questioning Colonel Harrison's judgment. She couldn't blame them. If she had been in their position, with years of combat experience and proven field leadership, she probably would have questioned the assignment of an intelligence analyst to a critical extraction mission too. But she was in this position now, and self-doubt wouldn't help anyone. Sarah gathered her materials and headed back to her quarters to begin the most important mission preparation of her career. What she didn't know was that 3 buildings away, Major Thompson was having a very different conversation than she had imagined. "What do you think about the lieutenant?" Captain Martinez asked as they walked toward the mess hall. Major Thompson considered the question carefully. "I think Colonel Harrison doesn't make personnel decisions lightly." "That's not what I asked." "I know what you asked." Major Thompson stopped walking and turned to face his colleague. "Rick, I've worked with Harrison for 6 years. I've seen him make calls that seemed crazy at the time, but turn out to be exactly right. And you think this is one of those times?" "I think Lieutenant Chen wrote an analysis that prevented a mission failure 3 weeks ago, and I think if Harrison says she's the right person for this job, then maybe we should listen." Captain Martinez nodded slowly. "I just hope she's ready for what we're walking into tomorrow." Major Thompson looked back toward the building they had just left, where he could see Sarah's silhouette still sitting in the briefing room. "I hope we all are." Neither of them realized that their conversation was being watched from a third-floor window by Colonel Harrison, who was beginning to believe that Operation Desert Shield might actually succeed. Some stories begin with doubt. Others start with laughter. But the most powerful ones, they begin with someone being completely underestimated. Picture this: a room full of hardened soldiers, each one carrying years of combat experience, tactical knowledge, and unshakable confidence. Now imagine their faces when they're told that their next mission, one that could determine the fate of hundreds of lives, will be led by someone they've dismissed as nothing more than a recruiting poster mistake. This isn't a story about proving people wrong. It's about what happens when the person everyone overlooks becomes the only one who can see the solution. It's about the moment when laughter turns to silence, when doubt transforms into desperate hope, and when the joke becomes the lifeline. What you're about to read isn't fiction. It's the raw, unfiltered account of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a 26-year-old intelligence officer who went from being the punchline of mess hall conversations to leading one of the most critical operations in modern military history. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. It almost never happened. 3 times, Sarah was passed over for field assignments. Twice, she was told she wasn't command material. And once, just 48 hours before this mission, she was actually recommended for transfer to a desk job in Washington. The commanders who laughed at her would soon be begging for her expertise. The soldiers who questioned her presence would fight to be on her team. And the enemy who had never heard her name would learn to fear it. This is what happens when underestimation meets determination, when quiet competence explodes into undeniable leadership, and when the system that tries to keep someone down becomes the very stage where they shine brightest. The mission was supposed to be impossible. The team was supposed to fail. And Sarah Chun? She was supposed to stay in the background, analyze data, and keep quiet. None of that happened. Welcome to the story of how a joke became a hero.